Today we're going to be talking about the Big Apple, back before anyone called it that. We're going back to the year 1664, when New York was controlled by the Dutch, and was still known as New Netherland. At the time, the community didn't extend much beyond the very southern tip of what we now call Manhattan, and numbered only a few thousand people, even if you included all the scattered villages and farms that existed along the shores of modern Brooklyn, Queens, and surrounding areas of Long Island. But in the world of 17th century geopolitics and commerce, New Netherland punched well above its weight, as it was a bustling, multicultural trade hub populated by not only Dutchmen, but also Englishmen, Jews, emancipated black yeomen, immigrants from all over Western Europe, and enslaved peoples captured from Spanish ships. From the English point of view, it was also an aberration, because it separated England's Massachusetts colony in the northeast and England's Virginia-based colony to the south. In a newly published book titled Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America, historian Russell Shorto gives a blow-by-blow account of how the English took Manhattan from the Dutch, without bloodshed, and crucially, without destroying the thriving cosmopolitan trading culture that the Dutch had fostered, and which has persisted to this day, 3.5 centuries later. In my interview with Shorto, who is also the founder of the New Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical Society, he'll describe the two main characters in this drama. Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch colonial administrator who served as the Director General of New Netherland, and the much lesser-known Richard Nicolls, the English military officer who was tasked with taking Manhattan by his childhood friends, King Charles II and his brother, the future King James II, who'd been restored to power following the English Civil War. As you'll hear, taking Manhattan was just one of the two big jobs that the royals had dispatched Richard Nicolls to accomplish in 1664. The other was to restore some order to Boston, which rogue Puritans had turned into a sort of quasi-theocratic city-state during the chaos of the English Civil War. The nature of the two projects, Shorto argues, sounds important echoes that signal America's two conflicting identities right up to the present day. The hardline Christian identity that took root in Boston, and the more diverse and capitalist society that emerged in New Netherland, and that Richard Nicolls, to his great credit, preserved following the peaceful takeover of the future metropolis. Please enjoy my interview with author and historian Russell Shorto, author of Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America. Russell Shorto, thank you for joining the Quillette Podcast.
Happy to be with you.
Tell me a little bit about Richard Nicolls, because Peter Stuyvesant, who kind of came out on the losing end of this, although even that's complicated, his name is well known in New York. Richard Nicolls, much less so, despite the fact that in some ways he's kind of the father of New York.
Yeah, that's why I devoted so much time to him, because he's so consequential and so little known. I mean, for a writer of history, that's kind of ideal. You talked about him being complicated. I actually find him to be a pretty straightforward figure compared, for example, to Stuyvesant, who had all these, always seemed to have a lot of sort of baggage, a lot of things.
He wore a lot of hats, and he had a lot of different constituencies he had to please.
Yeah, and he had this, he had a temper. He had this feeling that he should be treated. I mean, he called the people who in his colony his subjects, so he kind of felt like, he should be treated as royalty.
Just a quick little aside. Is he one of these guys who benefited from the fact that whatever you could say about him, he was better than the guy he replaced?
Oh, I think Stuyvesant was quite a capable leader. He had a lot of, I think he came into the job. We're now talking about Stuyvesant leading the colony of New Netherland. He came in with certain expectations about how this was going to go. He came into a colony that was in upheaval. They replaced the previous leader, who had started a war against the native people, and the Dutch and the colonists themselves had opposed that war because they were there to do business, to trade with the native people. So he thought he had to come in and really be heavy-handed And then he quickly learned that these colonists of his were very strong-willed traders. They had their own trading networks that extended to the Caribbean and South America and Europe, and they weren't going to just, bow down to him.
Wasn't a feudal situation.
Yeah, and once he learned that, which took him a while, then he did something very clever and very skillful. He refashioned his job and saw himself as kind of a middleman between the directors of the Dutch West India Company, under whose auspices this colony existed, and these traders, his population on Manhattan and elsewhere in the colony.
I got the sense that in modern parlance, it was almost a good cop, bad cop situation where he was the good local cop, sort of intermediating with sort of the bad cop overseas, the corporate types back in Netherlands who didn't really understand the situation fully in New York City.
Yeah, there was a lot of that. He had to mediate between these two. The directors of the company were these wealthy people in the home country who none of whom were ever going to travel to America. They had no notion. He was uh, often trying to, like, give them a sense of like how big these areas were, how far it was to get from Manhattan to Beverwijk to Albany, which is 150 miles up the river. It wasn't just like, oh, run there and back. And then he would turn around with the traders, his population. And I think with those he was close with, he was able to kind of say, of course, it's not written down, these kinds of interactions, but he was able to say, look, here's what I'm dealing with back home. Help me out here. Help me, work with me. And so in doing this, what he did, which he has never been fully given credit for, although a colleague of mine, Dennis Micah, is writing a book about just this subject right now. He created Manhattan, later New York City, as this capitalistic global trading center, and so he laid the groundwork for what New York City became.
My original question had been about Richard Nicolls, and then I interrupted you. I haven't seen any like statues to Richard Nicolls anywhere in Manhattan.
Yeah,
Maybe they exist,
yeah.
but can you tell us a little bit? Give us a biographical sketch.
So Richard Nicolls is from a little town in Bedfordshire called Ampthill. His lifetime is one of great turmoil in England. You have for the longest time, of course, you had kings running the place, and beginning in the early 1600s, the Puritans start to grow in power. And the Puritans, as the name suggests, they want to purify society and they want to purify the monarchy. The monarchy they associate with corruption and the corruption in the Church of England. So they want to create this new church that is more aligned with what God wants. And by the middle of the century, this erupts into civil war. The Puritans have gained power in Parliament, and Charles the First, the father of the Charles the Second and James, is dead set against the Puritans taking power. It comes to a head literally when the Puritans capture Charles the First and behead him. And then the Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell, becomes the leader of England. The two young princes, Charles and James, flee into exile on the continent of Europe. Now, Richard Nicolls grows up in this little village of Ampthill at a time when the Charles I, before he's beheaded, is a great hunter, and he visits regularly with his sons. Because this Ampthill is the center of the royal hunting ground. And Richard Nicolls' father is the keeper of this hunting preserve. And the largest, fanciest house for the king and his family to stay in is Richard Nicolls' father's house. So you get this picture then of these two young princes growing up with this 6 or 8 year older boy, Richard Nicolls. Because they would come regularly and they would hunt together and play and do all these, manly boy activities. then, naturally enough, when the Civil War happens, when society splits into the Puritans and the Royalists, Richard Nicolls and his family side with the Royalists because they've known them all their lives. Nicolls, when they go into exile, he goes with them, and he is particularly attached to James, the younger of the two Stuart sons. So he's there with them throughout the period of the Civil War and when Oliver Cromwell is leading the Puritan government. And he's acting as a spy and as a go-between.
This would be the 1650s?
That's right. Trying to get the royals back on the throne. Finally, in 1658, Cromwell dies, and in 1660, the English are exhausted by this turmoil, and they invite now Charles II to take the throne. So the royals come back, and Richard Nicolls comes with them. So his whole life, he has been connected to these people. They trust him. They've known him since they were all children. They then are in London. It's 1660. They have, for decades, the English have been envious of the Dutch, who have built this global trading empire. And they now decide, all right, we're back on the throne. We have to catch up. They look across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, and what they see are English colonies in New England and English settlements in Virginia and Maryland. And this whole piece in between, the Dutch started in 4 decades earlier, started their colony of New Netherland with the capital, New Amsterdam, on Manhattan Island. So the Dutch have, they're trading in West Africa, they're trading in Asia, they're the only nation, a European nation that trades with Japan. They're active all over the world, and there they are in North America with this colony that is kind of taking a bite out of these English colonies in North America. So the king and his brother want to send an expedition to take over this Dutch colony. The second mission of this expedition is going to be to deal with the English in New England.
Let me stop you right there, because this very interesting subplot. His first order of business had nothing to do with New York. Nicolls, as he was sailing across the Atlantic, his first order of business was to stop in Boston. At the time, the Puritans who'd come to the area we now call Massachusetts were running a kind of little theocracy, and they didn't think much of the English throne at the time, right?
Well, exactly.
And Nicolls had to knock them into shape, as I understand.
That was part of his mission, because so throughout this whole century, you've had the Puritans in opposition to the monarchy and the Church of England and other institutions, and it came to this violent civil war. Now the Stuarts are back on the throne, and it was the Puritans who founded these colonies, in particular the Massachusetts Bay Colony, based in Boston. And over these decades, they have grown very powerful with this religious kind of theocracy, and they continue to despise the Stuarts, even though the Stuarts are back on the throne.
But it's not quite a secessionist movement, but there's clearly a huge divide.
Yeah, I mean, they're not doing anything so brash as to separate from England, but they are doing their best to ignore England.
You not only focus on Nicolls, you focus on some key members of his retinue as he sailed west. And there was one or two very important figures who essentially were kind of religious refugees from Massachusetts who'd gone to England and knew all about who was who back in Boston and where the bodies were buried, so to speak.
Yeah, there were, I think, 24 people who had lived in Massachusetts and who show up in London to when the new monarch comes on the throne, to tell the king, look, do you realize what's going on? How these people are just, they're minting their own money.
Wow. That does sound like a almost separatist move. I mean, if this had gone another way, I mean, it sounds like Boston in a generation or two could have created its own country, and history could have been very different.
American historians have long looked to this period as kind of the forerunner to what the New Englanders are going to do, and particularly Boston is going to do in the Revolution. Nicolls then has this twin mission. And the one mission, what we've been talking about now, is to make the Puritans based in Boston toe the line, make them bow down to the monarchy. And I should say that, when we talk about the Royalists in that party in England, it didn't just mean people who loved the king. What united the Royalists were opposition to Puritans.
Mm.
They were people who did not want the Puritans to take over and to outlaw Christmas and dancing and theater, and which is what the Puritans did. They wanted some sort of normalcy, a return to normalcy. So Nicolls' first mission is to go to Boston and try, and as you say, the language of his commission is such that they're basically saying, see what you can do here. Try to make the Puritans toe the line. The second mission was to take this colony from the Dutch. So Nicolls had his hands full on both of these fronts. And what he was able to do ultimately was take the colony from the Dutch, although, the whole point of the book is it wasn't a very straightforward takeover.
So let's pick.
Yeah.
I want to put a bookmark on that, because now we've talked a little bit about things from the English perspectives and what their situation was. Now maybe let's shift our gaze. As you take pains to note, this is not the first time this territory changed hands. Originally, of course, the whole area was inhabited by and controlled by indigenous groups. You make the point. It's mind-blowing when I visit Manhattan now to think of it, that Broadway is a former indigenous trail. Tell us about the indigenous facts on the ground that pre-existed the Europeans arriving.
The area around New York City and New Jersey was the homeland of the people who were variously called Lenape or Munsee or Delaware. Long Island has several different native groups, the Shinnecock, the Montauk. Further north, in what's now New York State, you had on the east side of the Hudson River, you had the Mohican people, and on the west side and moving westward, you had the Haudenosaunee nations, also called the Iroquois. Each of these is different people who speak a different language from one another, who have different customs, who periodically are at war with one another. I mean, yes, the Europeans came and sort of imposed themselves on this landscape. Nevertheless, most of these native groups saw something in it for them. They were interested in European manufactured goods. They didn't produce metal objects. They were interested in knives and guns. And if two or more native groups are traditionally at war with one another, and one of them suddenly has muskets.
Further complicated by the fact that indigenous conceptions of real estate ownership and control were very different from those of the Europeans. But in broad strokes, how did the southern tip of Manhattan become a de facto Dutch possession?
I think the Dutch came very early to understand that the native people had a different notion of, they didn't have a concept of...
It wasn't fee simple land ownership.
Real estate transfer, yeah. At the same time, so the what you're referring to is the deed for the purchase, quote, purchase of Manhattan Island in 1626, yeah. What they would have done, what the Dutch would have done, is two things. They would have entered a ceremony that the native people would understand for not a transfer of real estate, but for something like an alliance. So from the native perspective, it would have been, okay, this is our territory, this island is our land, but we'll allow you to come here as well, and we will defend one another if one of us is attacked. And it had to be renewed. So there were a lot of ways that the native people looked at it that the Dutch, I think, very quickly learned. At the same time, the Dutch were conscious, of course, of other Europeans, the English, the French, And so they wanted to have a deed, somewhat thing, and for that matter, to other Dutch people, that they could show a deed saying, "Look, we purchased this." So they did negotiate a deed as part of this, and that deed has been lost. But what remains is a letter that, when the next ship returned to the Dutch Republic, an official named Peter Schagen wrote a summary of what had just happened, what he learned from the people on board, for his bosses. And he said, "Our people have purchased the island of Manhattan for the value of 60 guilders." And that did not mean an outright purchase price.
This was the European spin on what had happened.
That's right. So 60 guilders, which then gets translated or converted to $24, the infamous swindle. And certainly from our perspective, it was a swindle. But on the ground at the time, which is how I try to look at it when I'm doing history, what they were doing was not purchasing it for $24. What they were doing was giving. What you did in these ceremonies was you gave gifts as a way of sealing this deal. And the deal again was not a purchase. It was like, we'll both use this island. So that's I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's maybe complicated enough. That's the so-called purchase of Manhattan Island. Then the Dutch went on and did hundreds of deeds with native groups up and down the Hudson River throughout New Netherland, which was, by the way, quite a broad territory. It encompassed all or parts of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, some of Pennsylvania, Delaware. So it was a big area, and they were doing what then Europeans would continue to do, and that's the story of North America, of the U.S. and of Canada. It's just, that's how it began, and the purchase of Manhattan is one of the first and probably the most infamous of these.
A lot of the background here is European conceptions of what makes it legally official when a European power takes possession of what we now call a colony. And so, in the French context, Samuel de Champlain was very eager to set up these year-round settlements, even though often half the people died of scurvy by the time spring came, because the idea was, if you had a year-round settlement, that created facts on the ground, and in European legal terms, that gave you a case for possession. In your book, you talk about how the English just took it for granted that, from a European perspective, they had legal right to the entire coastline. Maybe this question can't be answered. Who had the better legal claim to Manhattan in 1660?
Well, the English claim was certainly very tenuous because it was the logic was a contiguity. So John Cabot, who, by the way, is an Italian who had sailed for the English.
He went to Newfoundland, I think.
Yeah, because he touched
Henry VII. This was the time of Henry VII.
Because he touched foot more than a century before in Newfoundland. Then, all of basically North America, presumably, magically was under the domain of the English monarch. That was their logic. Now, they couldn't defend that. They couldn't even think about it, really, for a long time. Then the Dutch come along and they say, this is our territory, and they start negotiating treaties with native people. And they build this colony. And for 40 years, they have this colony. And because of their prowess, because of their capitalism, and because of the strategic significance of New York Harbor and Manhattan Island, they have this little empire going where they're trading from Manhattan with parts of Europe and the Caribbean. So they developed this very sophisticated place. Finally, then, coming back to our story, the English are ready to say, no, we want that because we want to get serious about developing North American colonies. And then they go back to that logic of possession and of contiguity, that, oh, wait, this guy, 100 years or more ago, touched foot there and planted a little flag. Therefore, the whole of North America is ours by right.
So they saw the Dutch presence there as kind of like a sort of a geographical aberration that they were just coming to sort out.
Yeah, that the Dutch just took advantage of the fact that the English were distracted by their civil war and other things.
The French would have a viceroy. It was, somebody who was connected to the royal family, and everything was integrated into the crown but that for the Dutch, it was kind of a corporate project, like outsourced?
The Dutch system, which they built their empire based on, the Dutch Republic was a very loose confederation, kind of like the American Confederation before the Constitution, where in the American context, the states had all the power and the federal government had none. That was sort of the situation in the Dutch Republic. It was very, you had these individual provinces, Friesland and Holland and Utrecht, um, and they did their foreign diplomacy and their building of their empire by means of first the Dutch East India Company, which operated in Asia, and then the Dutch West India Company, which tried to do the same thing in the West Indies. And the West Indies meant, if you're in Europe and looking at a map of Europe, basically everything to your left. So coastal North America, the Caribbean, and South America. That's the West Indies. The East India Company just immediately exploded with wealth, exploiting
Spices. Yeah.
with spices and this luxury trade. The West India Company never really made a go of it. They kept plotting and plotting, and it was much harder to do. New Netherland was founded as a West India Company under West India Company auspices. So that's how the Dutch Empire operated.
You make the point that in many ways, the Dutch who lived in what we now call Manhattan were much more cosmopolitan than the English. They inhabited what, in some ways, is a multicultural society. And I don't want to exaggerate this point because I think Peter Stuyvesant, he banned Jews at one point, and I mean, there were all sorts of official prohibitions on what kind of religion you could be. But some of your protagonists in your book are free Black people who operated as merchants, and it does seem to have had a multicultural kind of freewheeling character to it.
Yeah, that's very much part of my thesis, with those caveats. The Dutch pioneered religious toleration in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And because they had, and this was a time when intolerance was official policy in England and France and Spain, and common sense. The idea was, it's a dangerous world out there. If we're going to get ahead, we all have to be on the same page. The Dutch did something different. They said they made diversity work, and they became probably the most powerful nation in the world, as tiny as they were, certainly in Europe for a time, by exploiting this notion of diversity and religious toleration. So in New Netherland, the same thing. There's this overarching policy of religious toleration. Peter Stuyvesant, the last and the most prominent director of the colony, was himself quite intolerant for these practical reasons, and I think also for his own religious way of looking at things. He thought Jews were a deceitful race, and he tried to bar them from settling, and when he couldn't, he just tried to make life difficult for them. The same with the Quakers.
Taxation and sort of rules.
And so he taxed them as burghers, like citizens of the city, but he wouldn't give them the privileges of burghers. So what they did, they appointed one of the small Jewish community, appointed one of them their leader, and he went to court and said, either tax us and give us the privileges, or don't tax us. And then Stuyvesant tried to say, too bad, if you don't like it, leave. They appealed to the home country, and Stuyvesant was overruled. So that's kind of, you might say, a civil rights story, and the system working. Famously, there were at one point 18 languages being spoken on Manhattan when there were probably only about 500 people there.
Wow.
So, as I like to say, New York was New York even before it was New York. So yeah, that is a seed of what New York later became.
So you talk a lot about slavery in the book, and rightly so. Peter Stuyvesant seemed to have no moral objection to slavery. At the same time, there are two factors that militate the other way. One is that you also have scenes where slaves would come to him and he would effectively emancipate them. That wouldn't have been the term he used, but they'd been in loyal service to people in the colony, and it was by his hand that they gained their freedom. Slavery seems to have been a commercial fact. He saw it as something that could help make a buck, but he doesn't seem to have been a monomaniacal bigot or somebody who endorsed slavery for its own sake. Slavery was most horrific and most popular in colonies like Haiti, or Saint Domingue, where you needed thousands and thousands of people to create cash crops. And the situation was completely inhumane, and Europeans wouldn't do it. Whereas that wasn't really the commercial situation in New York City. It sounds like slaving in New York City at the time, it was more like kind of a hub for slaves. It wasn't like thousands of them were being imported and put to work making sugar or cotton.
I think the main factor is that slavery was a very ad hoc thing for almost the whole life of the Dutch
It's
colony.
mentioned almost casually in the documentation, like, a ship would arrive and say it contained this many bales of this and this many bales of that and 50 slaves.
For most of the life of the colony, enslaved Africans arrived by accident. So the Dutch were fighting a war against the Spanish and the Portuguese, and a Dutch ship would capture a Spanish or Portuguese ship in the Caribbean. And they knew that there was this Dutch colony in Manhattan, so they'd haul it there and then drop them off.
It was war booty, basically.
So it's like, okay, the leader of the colony is like, all right, now I have to deal with these people. So those first enslaved Africans were put to work for the West India Company in New Amsterdam. And that's more or less how slavery operated in the colony until almost, within 5 years of the English takeover. This gets back to the point of the West India Company was not able to make a profit either in New Netherland or in the Caribbean and South America. What it was doing, it kept trying different things. Finally, they say, all right, let's go all in on slavery. So the directors say to Stuyvesant, we want you to, the phrase was, experiment with a consignment of Negroes. Stuyvesant in 1660, then, the first begins this process of trying to make Manhattan into a hub for slavery. And as you say, it was not, you didn't have a situation where you had plantations and that kind of thing. So it was more like, let's start bringing enslaved Africans here and selling them. We'll sell them, there are English planters in Maryland and Virginia. We'll sell them to them. So that's what what they had in their mind. Then 1664, Richard Nicolls comes in, and, we haven't talked much about the actual, what happens with the transfer.
No, I'm saving that.
Yeah, but it becomes New York. But 2 weeks before Nicolls arrived, the first big shipment of Africans came, right. 290 men, women, and children. So then it was largely left to the English to figure out, okay, what do we do now? Are we going to make slavery into a business here?
Let's get back to the timeline. Nicolls has sorted things out to the best of his ability in Boston. I think he probably realized this was going to be a long-term project. And they said, okay, well, now I'm going to go do the second item on my to-do list, which is take Manhattan. It's the title of your book. But what happens, you describe it very artfully. It's not exactly a military encounter because there was no military action, so to speak. It really is kind of literally gunboat diplomacy, where Nicolls sailed his little armada. I mean, very small by contemporary military standards, but more than enough force to, if he had wanted to, he could have stormed Manhattan. And the defenses were fairly primitive. And I think, as you describe it, the arsenal there had been kind of shortchanged by Amsterdam. They hadn't really invested in defenses properly, and a lot of the militia was ad hoc. And he kind of said, I don't want this is Nicolls, I don't want this to get ugly, so hand over the keys. It's over.
Well, as you had said earlier, Nicolls, when he was still in London, was really doing his homework. He was interviewing all these disgruntled...
they were a huge asset to him. They had all this intelligence. Yeah.
So he was learning about Boston and the Puritans and how strong they were. He was also learning about New Amsterdam. He interviewed people who had lived there, people who had worked in Stuyvesant's government.
And some came with him on the ship, right?
Yes, he brought them with him. So he was very well informed, and he became more and more intrigued about what this place was, what the Dutch had built there.
By the way, he's something of a scientist and an empiricist. There's all this correspondence at the time.
He's connected to people at the Royal Society.
Intellectually curious person.
He's a very, as by the way was Stuyvesant. Mm-hmm. They were all part of this network of, sort of gentlemen.
They're all like sending letters to each other like, I saw the most extraordinary bird. Let me describe it.
Yeah.
That's kind of funny.
So Nicolls then sails into New York Harbor, 4 ships, 450 soldiers, filled to the brim with gunpowder and things. And his mission is just, they just fought a war with the Dutch. They were about to fight another one. Just, take it. So that was his brief. But he had learned that the Dutch had created something very special, and he knew that if he just bombed away and took the island, he'd just have an island. What he came to realize was he wanted this secret sauce, this society, and that meant appeasing them. So he decided he is going to do everything he possibly can to make it appealing for them to give it to him. And what he did, this is the 2-week back and forth with Nicolls in his ships in the harbor.
Delegations are coming back and forth to the deck of his ship,
rowing back and forth with messages. Several times, one side or the other gives up and they say, you know what, we're going to just open fire. Then the temperature lowers and they start over again. But basically, the terms of surrender that they worked out, it was nobody surrendered anything,
right,
except they gave over overall control. But the terms, the so-called Articles of Surrender, is a Bill of Rights to the people of New Netherland. And it says you will keep your homes, you'll keep your families, your businesses, your trade networks. By all means, that's exactly what Nicolls wanted.
And he stuck to it, I think, more or less.
He
right?
stuck to it. There were times when they had to remind him. They would come to him literally waving this paper saying, this is our agreement. So from the Dutch perspective, as you had hinted at, they had come to realize, not just Stuyvesant, but everybody in New Amsterdam had come to realize that they were not going to get real support from the West India Company from Europe. They weren't getting soldiers. They weren't getting more settlers. So they were on their own. From Nicolls' side, he now wants this thing that they've created. So they realize in this negotiation that there is something that they, meaning the people on the ground, want that is in common. The people in Europe are going to be annoyed when the Dutch find out about it. When the West India Company finds out, they're going to be really annoyed. But for the people on the ground, the 1,500 people in New Amsterdam, the 10,000 people in the colony, this is a pretty decent situation for them because they'll keep everything they have. And the flag on top of the fort will change, but they'll keep everything they have. In allowing them to maintain everything that they had, Nicolls creates a new city, New York, an English city that operates very much along Dutch principles. And that's the essence of New York City, that from the beginning, it operated differently from other places in the British Empire as it developed.
And it's kind of ironic because he had just been to Boston, which the Puritans had come to Massachusetts saying, we're going to build this, the city on a hill, and it's going to be like the perfect English society. We're going to start over. All of the corruption of the old world will be forgotten, and we're going to build this perfect English puritanical society, which was rejected. The English who came were like much more impressed with this Dutch model.
Well, that's because you have two different sides in England. You have the Puritans and you have the Royalists who are the moderates, basically. And what, in terms of looking at this in terms of later American history and right down to today, what Nicolls' two missions, the failure to deal with the Bostonians, allows Puritanism to grow and flourish as an American ideology. And his success in negotiating this deal for Manhattan allows this other sensibility, this moderate, this globalist sensibility to take root in America. And those two forces, I would argue, have been at war with each other ever since in American history.
Let's talk about the aftermath, because when Peter Stuyvesant went back to Netherlands, he had to face the music. They were like, how could you just, you literally just gave the English New York? Did the same thing happen to Nicolls when he went back to England? Did he face the music for being so generous and, call it, malleable in the terms that he gave to what we would now call New Yorkers?
We don't have any evidence that he got flack for the way that he negotiated it. Maybe he did, but we don't have any evidence for it. Stuyvesant, as you say, was recalled and put on trial. And he spent about 2 years defending himself. And in a sense, he didn't have an argument because, yeah, he did give it
It
away, and
was all there in black and white,
that
right?
was
I
his
mean, it's
charge.
richly documented. Yeah.
But what he argued was, you didn't give me the means to defend it. Yeah, we asked for years. We kept saying we need more, and he did.
He created a paper trail. By the way, there's a modern corporate lesson there. Create a paper trail.
That showed him writing to them saying, you have to give us a means to defend the place, otherwise the English are going to take it. I mean, it was obvious what was going to happen. In that 2-week standoff, he had to deal with question of his loyalties. He had a loyalty to the West India Company, he had loyalty to the Dutch government, but ultimately he decided that his greatest loyalty was to this community that he himself had helped to build. He had raised his family there. People had, they were in their second, third generation of New Netherlanders. So that preserving that was his greatest, the thing that was most important to him, and that's what he did. Ultimately, he was exonerated. And then the most interesting thing of all about Stuyvesant is what he did next. He went back. He went back and lived out his life in New York as a New Yorker, and seems to have been kind of an unofficial advisor to Nicolls.
Is it weird that Stuyvesant's name is well known? It's it's part of a neighborhood in Brooklyn, whereas I'm guessing 99 out of 100 modern day New Yorkers have no idea who Richard Nicolls is.
I think it's more than it's 99.9.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is weird because Nicolls was the so-called victor. Stuyvesant, however, was there for his period in office was 17 years, and then he went back and lived the rest of his life there. So he had a longer time to put an imprint on the place. Nicolls, the interesting thing about him, Stuyvesant decides to go back, indicating that that really was his home. It had become his home. Nicolls, after 4 years as the first governor of New York, the man who names New York after the Duke of York, who almost names New Jersey, Albania, and who sets the parameters of New York City. He decided Manhattan Island would be New York City, whereas before it was just the tiny triangle of land at the financial district that was New Amsterdam. So in many ways, he defined New York. After 4 years, he asks to be reassigned. He's done with his job. And so I think that may have something to do with it. He didn't, although he met his footprint was quite big. It was I guess shallow as far as history was concerned.
And he went full circle. As I understand, he went back to this Amped Hill, the old royal hunting grounds, and was buried with full honors in the church, I think, right?
Yeah, I visited with the town historian. We visited his the church there has this lovely little tomb of his in the church with a British and an American flag on it,
Oh, that's so nice.
Supposedly the cannonball with which he was, because in 1672, then he's in battle off the coast of England against the Dutch and dies there. And supposedly the cannonball that killed him is embedded in the tomb. Though how anybody would know at the time, if you think about it, wait, that guy is going to be seen as important because he founded New York, and I'm going to grab that cannonball,
Okay, one last question, which is about the physical way that history is commemorated. So earlier in your book, you're talking about the English ships are approaching. This is the southern tip of, I guess, what's now Brooklyn. There's this tiny little outpost on the coast, and the Dutch soldiers there see the English ships, and they raise the hue and cry.
There was a Dutch blockhouse, a Dutch lookout on Staten Island on the shore, and they saw the ships come in, and the ships actually anchored in Gravesend Bay opposite there, because that was an English community within New Netherland. So they then sent word to New Amsterdam.
And the subplot here is that there were actually a lot of English speakers or English descendants who were in the area who kind of became natural allies for Nicolls.
Yeah, that's why. So when Nicolls sailed into again, having done his homework, he knew that Gravesend was a town within New Netherland that had been settled by the English. The Dutch, being this multicultural people, they allowed English people to settle as well. So Gravesend was a largely English-speaking community, and Nicolls went there and anchored there, knowing that that would be a friendly base within the colony.
After I read your book, I happened to be doing a business trip to New York City, And I said, you know what? I'm going to visit some of these important historical sites. And I went out to Gravesend Bay thinking, I'm going to see what the perspective would have been of these Dutch soldiers in their blockhouse, seeing this Armada approach. It's kind of like the Star Wars Imperial March theme plays in their head. And so this is going to be so dramatic. And I found the place on the map that I thought corresponded to your description. And I went there ready for the momentous weight of history to be felt on my shoulders. And there I was in the middle of Coney Island. And I think I was standing next to some guy selling foam domes and candy floss. And I didn't see like a lot of historical plaques or anything like that, which I thought was kind of an interesting metaphor for the ignorance that a lot of modern Americans revere history in very specific contexts, like the Boston Tea Party. But the Dutch fact, like even this little encounter, I thought, well, that should be celebrated. The point where that blockhouse was should be, a museum. Sometimes American history, it feels like it starts with George Washington, whereas I find this stuff much more interesting.
New York City in particular just paves things over. It's just always about right now and about the future. Whereas Boston, to continue the contrast, it's always the 1700s.
Russell Shorto is the author of Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America. Thank you so much for being on the Quillette Podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's been fun.